Welcome to the Connected Enterprise Podcast. This is Carl Lewis, your host from Vision 33. And today my guest is Thomas McInerney. Thomas is an international lawyer. I have been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. Thomas, welcome to the podcast. Tell us a little bit more specifically about the kind of work you do.
Hi, Carl. Thanks very much for having me. International lawyer doesn't necessarily conjure up a lot of associations for some people, but I've been working basically as a lawyer first in the United States and focusing on domestic clients and also some international, but mostly I worked in the area of securities, mergers and acquisition law. But gradually, I started to work more on kinds of issues affecting global sustainable development. And so looking at the ways in which countries' legal systems could be improved to enable economic and social development to occur in a more streamlined fashion, and also look at the international treaty system and the kinds of international agreements that support economic and political and social development in countries. I work as the executive director for a Center on Rule of Law and Development at Loyola University Chicago School of Law and teach in the area of international rule of law and development. Been doing that for many years now.
You're living abroad right now, right?
That's correct. Yes, I live in Bangkok, Thailand.
It's early morning for you. I appreciate your
Yeah.
getting out of bed early. Business is certainly global these days, and it seems like what happens one place trickles and has an impact every place. And that's why some of these questions I think are really interesting for the SME part of the world. How is the supply chain of the small business area potentially impacted by trade agreements?
Well, trade agreements are really important for all businesses, but small businesses is no different. And trade agreements, there's really two major contributions that off the top of my head. I mean, one of the things is the ways in which companies have access to markets outside of the US and their ability to sell products in countries. Over the past 20, 30 years, there's been an increase in major international trade agreements that have provided American companies with access to markets that in the past would have been subject to tariffs. So it depends on the line of business and the market that you're selling into. But in many cases, the tariff regime has come down significantly, and that makes it easier to sell products overseas. Another aspect of trade agreements is in terms of the administrative aspect of selling into other countries, that there's often a lot of paperwork, there's often a lot of administrative aspects of selling your goods or services overseas. And trade agreements can facilitate those processes and make it more streamlined, which reduces cost and reduces the time. There's been a lot of interesting developments in relation to trade and thinking about trade agreements that I think are going to have bigger effects for small business in the coming years. And this is really one of the outcomes of the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis, and the major supply chain disruptions that we've seen. Because in addition to being able to sell internationally, American companies are also importing goods and using those in their supply chains. And as we know, there were big bottlenecks associated with the pandemic. And what trade negotiators are looking at now is how to make for more resilient supply chains to prevent those kinds of imbalances from occurring.
Really interesting. Do you have examples of how, for instance, what used to be NAFTA and has now become USMCA, how that has made things better or worse for businesses in the USA?
That chapter is kind of interesting because it wasn't entirely apparent that NAFTA was negative for US businesses. It's obviously was made a major political issue, but if you look at the research, it's really unclear to what degree it's helped or hurt American businesses. There is some research that suggests that it may have affected jobs, probably at a much lower level than what was argued politically. But that same research also shows that NAFTA provided tremendous economic benefits. So in terms of dollars, the US benefited tremendously through NAFTA. Regardless of whether that was true or not, the USMCA has included some provisions that are interesting, I think, for American businesses, particularly for businesses working in the digital world. When NAFTA was negotiated in the early 90s, e-commerce was in its infancy. In NAFTA, there really wasn't any provisions relating to the whole digital marketplace and e-commerce. In the new agreement, there were significant additions included. Among those are things like preventing restrictions on requiring data to be held locally, reducing or preventing tariffs on digital commerce. Digital commerce can be taxed, but not in a discriminatory fashion against particular countries' firms.
Right.
It calls for providing open access to government data. And here's where the trade facilitation issue comes in. That trade can be facilitated in terms of the administrative and documentation can be done entirely electronically. So there doesn't need to be any paper involved in the transaction, really streamlining things tremendously. So for US companies in the digital marketplace, the USMCA does provide for a much more level playing field, particularly the free access, free transfer of data is a key element of that. The other aspect of the USMCA that is of interest, there was always this question about whether the labor standards, particularly in Mexico, were lower than US standards and whether that constituted, in a sense, an economic advantage to those producers. So there was a side agreement in NAFTA dealing with labor issues, but in the USMCA, there are some enhancements that essentially one of the requirements is in the auto industry paying workers $16 an hour minimum, which in a sense enables collective bargaining unions in Mexico to actually demand higher wages, which then will help level the playing field. So to the extent that there was this concern about whether US businesses and the US economy was losing out as a result of NAFTA, there have been some provisions that moderately enhance those protections.
That's interesting that it was guaranteeing the Mexican worker $16 an hour. I remember back in the 90s, they were making $29 an hour in Detroit. So, so there's a pretty big disparity between the two places. Likewise, the U.S. is no longer a part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Why is that specifically, and has that had, benefits somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, that whole episode was interesting from a political standpoint and from a geopolitical standpoint. And to take a step back, the nature of trade agreements has gradually been changing over time. And if you go back to the late 90s, for instance, if you remember, back in Seattle in 97, there was a huge, what was called anti-globalization protests happening at the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference in Seattle. And it was quite chaotic. And that kind of launched the anti-sweatshop movement and the demands by the environmental activists to include provisions relating to labor and environmental considerations in trade agreements. Fast forward to the Obama administration and the development of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and you see that the agreement has many provisions that were really much more thorough in terms of the kinds of protections that people were asking for 20 years earlier. Provisions relating to environmental protection, labor standards. And so that agreement was with many different types of countries throughout the Asia Pacific region of differing levels of economic development and what have you. And there were other provisions too that were added, things like anti-corruption. So basically requiring countries to make bribery a crime and to require that the solicitation and offer of bribes to government officials would be criminalized, something that was included in the OECD Convention on Bribery and the UN Convention on Corruption, was now being built into trade agreements. Also, transparency. So when governments changed the rules regulating particular segments of the economy, that they needed to adopt basically similar types of procedures to what would be followed in the US for administrative law changes. You have to provide notice, you have to provide the opportunity for people to comment, you have to provide reasons for the changes in the regulations. All these kinds of things were included in the TPP. But of course, it became politicized. and the US never ratified it. As a result, a very interesting development happened, which was that all of the other signatories, and there's Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, I think Indonesia, I mean, many countries throughout the Asia Pacific region, basically agreed among themselves that they would sign the TPP, and it was renamed, and essentially they incorporated by reference all of the provisions of the TPP, and then they added some new provisions to the so that agreement works for many countries in the region. And one of the rationales, I mean, this is a bit of an aside for what we're talking about, but one of the rationales was to help balance US and Western interests in the Asia Pacific area vis-a-vis China, and basically providing and strengthening US ties to countries in the region. That was, I think, the original rationale for that. In the meantime, China has been advancing its own trade agenda and put forward what's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is in force now between many of the same players in the region, including Australia, for instance, which it brings China into the trading system there in a way that maybe was not conceived of when the TPP was under development. So there's that geopolitical aspect which has happened.
It's interesting. These trade agreements, how difficult is it? I guess, what's the process like to be able to craft a free trade agreement between countries?
I personally haven't negotiated trade agreements, but it's a bear. I mean, it is a mammoth undertaking for countries. And now, trade agreements in the past used to be very narrow and very specific. We would work on specific sectors. So if you go back to the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades negotiating process, which lasted decades, they would attack specific sectors of the economy. And so it was a much more piecemeal kind of approach. What's happened in recent decades, some legal scholars call them mega trade agreements, where it includes everything. And as I described in terms of some of these provisions of the TPP relating to bribery, labor standards, government rulemaking and procurement, it's a much bigger animal. And so it's basically trying to really integrate disparate political and economic systems. And so you can imagine the number of different interests that come into play. Every country, it's not just there are issue specific interests, but then there are sectoral interests. So you may agree on a rule that may affect one industry in a positive way, but it may affect another industry in a negative way. And so the negotiators have a real challenge in terms of doing this. One of the controversial aspects of these trade agreements has been the role of the private sector. And to what degree do trade negotiators, are they engaging with the private sector, or are they doing the bidding of the private sector? And are they privileging the interests of private sector actors over consumers, for instance, or workers, and those kind of things? So the trade negotiators are in a very difficult situation. And in the US, it's made even more difficult because of the power of the Congress and the requirement for the Congress to approve trade agreements. There was a method developed which was designed to streamline the process called trade preferential authority. And it would give the US Office of Trade Representative the ability to negotiate trade agreements subject to certain parameters that were agreed upon by Congress and the USTR before that. And then the process for approval in Congress afterwards was an up or down. It was yes or no when the draft agreement came in. So that gave the USTR a greater amount of confidence that when it was negotiating the agreement, it would be presented to Congress and it would be approved. And during the whole process of negotiation, there would be ongoing information sharing with Congress about how the negotiations were going and this kind of thing. And that the TPA authority was expired and it hasn't been renewed. And so what's happening now in the Biden administration is negotiating a new, what they call Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is currently in negotiation. But it's unclear to what degree it will be a trade agreement. It's starting, I think the approach is a little bit different from traditional trade agreements. They're starting with more of a process of engagement and discussion with the various states. And that may, in time, culminate into negotiation of the specific trade agreements. But the Biden administration has not asked for the TPA authority, and this is the process underway right now to provide something in lieu of the TPP.
Interesting. Is it fair to say that trade agreements at one time were likely to be between just one or two countries, and now it seems like we're doing this regional approach, which definitely got to make it more complicated?
Yeah, absolutely. There are still a lot of bilateral individual countries among themselves, but these major trade agreements, these regional kinds of agreements, are becoming more common. Some of the polemics about globalization, is globalization over? And we heard all this during the COVID crisis. This is the death knell for globalization and all that. I think that's really not true in a lot of respects, in that if you're in business and you maybe, as a result of COVID-19, I think there have been a lot of businesses that have thought about reducing their supply chain risk and maybe onshoring things that they would have offshored previously. But really, the name of the game for most businesses is that they continue to procure and sell globally. And these kinds of trade regimes really make it easier to do so. And of course, there's still a lot of debate about what are the effects. Does it have negative effects on the economy, on the environment, and what have you? But certainly the trade agreements that we're seeing in development now are an improvement in those regards from the prior agreements.
What's the basis for ESG disclosure and due diligence standards? And you better define ESG for us as well.
That's another area that's come under criticism, particularly in the past 6 months, what's known as environmental, social, and governance standards, and applying that to business. And I can tell you from my own experience in the course of my professional career, this idea that businesses should be concerned with things like the environment or labor practices or human rights and all that, let's say 20 years ago, was really considered kind of out there, and it was not something that people really gave a lot of attention to. And one of the inflection points there, one of the drivers of concern about those issues was trade related, as I described in terms of the WTO process in 97 there. And what we've seen then over time is that the trade agreements have started to take these concerns more seriously. But also in terms of economic regulation overall, that there are growing approaches to encouraging, and in some cases requiring, companies to implement standards for basically two aspects of the business. One is a disclosure obligation, and the other is a due diligence obligation. And they're two different sets of requirements that will affect how businesses operate. But this has been growing over 20 years, and I think it looks like it's going to continue to grow. Some of that is the zeitgeist. It's about what people's expectation is about the world. I think that there are, as we see in terms of the kinds of media attention, we see many environmental problems happening in the world. I read an article the other day about the biodiversity loss, which you can read all of these things, and then something hits you and you say, oh my God. So the amount of vertebrate life in the planet has been reduced by 52% over the past 50 years. That kind of thing is happening. And so I think people and business owners, and our people too, are concerned about these things. Now, there's a whole host of questions about whether ESG should be a matter of voluntary activity by companies. Should they employ practices just because they want to be good corporate citizens? And the counter side to that is that sufficient to address the kinds of societal and environmental problems that the world is facing? The big story is that more and more of these issues are becoming matters of regulation. And the big player in this area, of course, is the European Union, which has gone much further. Some of the European countries have been implementing laws that make ESG practices mandatory. Yeah. Germany, France, among others. And now the EU is adopting regulations that pertain to both disclosure and due diligence relating to everything from human rights to climate change and, of course, labor standards.
In regards to this ESG disclosure and due diligence, how does it affect SMEs? And is there a way that they can find it useful for strategy and operations?
Good questions. Going back to that point about the European regulation, that those standards are intended to apply to large companies. But there's also a provision relating to companies that are in particularly risky businesses, meaning businesses that may have particularly disproportionate effects on things like the environment or labor standards. And so the threshold at which the proposed regulations will apply is set much lower for those firms in risky businesses. And so for a lot of SMEs, they will not have sufficient revenues. If you're a US company, you have to be doing $150 million in business in Europe and have over 500 employees to be subject to the rules, unless you're in the risky category, in which it's 40 million revenues and I think 250 employees. So you have to have a significant amount of business in Europe to be subject to those mandatory rules. But if you are participating in a supply chain with European-based companies, they are going to be required to apply those rules. And for the purposes of disclosing or managing risks in their supply chain, they're going to be asking you what your processes and procedures are and what your risks are. So there is a kind of long arm aspect to these European regulations that will affect the whole value chain. And of course, that's subject to thresholds too. If you're only a small supplier, then it's not going to rise to the level of materiality that they're going to necessarily need you to be changing your practices. But that's one way, that's, let's say, a hard way that SMEs may need to be thinking about these things more. But there's also the argument that people have made over time about what are the business advantages of applying ESG standards, or what we used to call corporate social responsibility. And
Right.
there's a lot of research that suggests that, well, there may be an advantage to your customers. They may see the company operating as a more responsible citizen and feel better about maintaining that relationship. I think that's perhaps overstated to the extent to which that's going to drive consumer or customer demand. But there is that aspect. And the flip side is the negative side of things. If your company, it's what people sometimes refer to as the front page test. If something that you're doing ends up on the front page of the newspaper, how are you going to feel about that? And so it's a matter of risk mitigation for companies to avoid things that it might be something that you're doing that could be legal, but if it were exposed, would be considered controversial because it goes against the tide of what standards and norms are considered acceptable today, such as human rights, which 20 years ago, there weren't human rights standards specifically for business. The UN has adopted something called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that describe businesses' obligations to mitigate and avoid any exposure to human rights abuses. So it's that kind of thing that I think there's a potential advantage, but also a potential risk management aspect for SMEs.
How have technology companies, this probably includes SMEs, how are they contributing to the implementation and operation of global treaties in the environmental field?
One of the aspects of my work as an international lawyer, I'm very interested in treaties as regulatory standards and how they apply to a whole bunch of different issues. And I've been studying the question of how technology is affecting the way in which treaties operate. And it's been very interesting because it's not a typical topic that international law has focused on, but increasingly it's becoming a concern because, as we all know, technology is playing a bigger and bigger role in our lives. And while there's a lot of concern about technology, we're talking nowadays much more about AI and the risks of that, and certainly privacy issues and surveillance issues. There's also another story, which is more salutary matter in relation to how technology is helping to inform treaty processes, for instance, treaties relating to the environment. And there are a whole lot of innovations happening. And in a lot of cases, SMEs are really playing a big role in this. And so what I've seen is a key part of managing treaties is monitoring the conditions that are happening in the world. So if we talk about biodiversity, how many species are out there? Are populations decreasing or increasing? What are the trends? All of that. And there's all sorts of new equipment that's been developed, for instance, what they call camera traps, which are put in forests that monitor endangered species on an ongoing basis. There's acoustic monitors that can be put in remote locations to monitor bird song and all sorts of things like this. And a lot of these new technologies are being developed by small companies that are operating in a niche and may oftentimes involve collaborations between scientists and the small businesses. And these various technologies that are developing are being integrated and applied in novel ways. So let's say it's not off the shelf kind of things, but a lot of
Right.
things are kind of bootstrapped solutions to provide better data and better knowledge about how international
Well,
uh,
Thomas,
law is working.
this has been fascinating for my audience. We'll appreciate some of this insight. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Till we talk to everyone again, stay connected.